Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. I am Robin Brumble, a registered nurse, as well as CLL Society's Director of Scientific Affairs and Research. At CLL Society, we are dedicated to bringing credible and up-to-date information to the CLL and SLL community because we believe smart patients get smart care. As a reminder, you can rewatch all of our educational programs by going to the section of our website called Education on Demand. We would like to thank our following partners for supporting today's webinar. At this time, I would like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Brian Kaufman, who is CLL Society's Executive Vice President and Chief Medical Officer.
Thank you, Robin. I would like to welcome our audience and speaker to today's event. We are joined by patient advocate Christina Rodriguez Fuller, who is a member of our patient advisory board, and she will be sharing her experience in participating in a clinical trial. Dr. Adrian Wiestner, senior investigator at the National Health, Lung, and Blood Institute of the National Institutes of Health, and he is a member of the CLL Society's Expert Medical Council. He's going to walk us through how clinical trials are conducted, how they are monitored for safety, and how you can access clinical trials as a treatment choice. Lastly, clinical research nurse Kaitlin Kennard, also a member of our Expert Medical Council, joins us from Abrams Cancer Center of the University of Pennsylvania. She will review important considerations such as the different arms of clinical trials, close monitoring, and any side effect issues, and additional cost and travel considerations. We would like to welcome Christina Rodriguez Fuller to share her experience in participating in a clinical trial.
I was diagnosed in 2018 by my general practitioner, who immediately sent me to a hematologist. So I was a little worried because it happened pretty quickly. I was pretty healthy. I've always eaten good and exercised. And I saw a hematologist within a week. She had sent me there, and he told me it would be a long time before I needed treatment. So I would just be doing the 6-month checkup and basically just waiting. I didn't get a lot of answers, nor did I really pay attention because I was just in a cloud. My head was just in a cloud. But once I was able to process it, I immediately started looking for, what I needed to know in researching CLL. Yes, I went to the internet, but I found out you were not supposed to. And just connecting with people. I did find CLL Society, the support group, and that was great. I found some online support groups as well. And I just started learning everything I could about CLL. Everyone was saying to see a CLL specialist. So I asked my husband, and I was really worried about it. I didn't know how much all this was going to cost us, but we both felt it was a good idea. So that's what we did. We went to MD Anderson, found a CLL specialist there, and did consultation and blood work and all that in January. So really that was just a few months after I was diagnosed. So I was pretty excited about that and getting to learn a little bit more about, what I had and what I had to go look forward to. He also agreed that I was pretty young and healthy, and it might be a long time before I would need treatment, but it was there. And he would also check me once a year. So I was going to go to my local guy for 6 months, and then he would make the year lab draws in appointments. So we decided that was good. And before we knew it, within a couple of years, my numbers really just went crazy. So we, by then I was seeing another CLL specialist in Dallas who had just moved there and started his camp there with the CLL community. And I was, going to him like every 3 months at that point, because my blood counts were going in the direction that we did not want them to go. And then the pandemic year started. And at that point, we decided I would be going into treatment. So I literally started the very same time the pandemic started. So we really weren't sure what was going to happen. And we were just going to take it, week at a time of lab draw infusion, one at a time, just to see how it went. And it all went well. I took the ECOG clinical trial in Dallas, and that was the one that both my CLL specialists in Houston at MD Anderson and my local CLL specialists recommended. And I decided to do the treatment in Dallas, since this was, pretty much where I live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So that's what I did. I'm very lucky, blessed to have a family that's very supportive, and really this is not just me, it's also them. So we really communicated from the beginning what I should do, how things were going to happen. And, I had their support, and we immediately started the treatment in April of 2020. So I did the treatment and everything was great. I was kind of scared doing some of the paperwork because the words are pretty scary, that this could happen, this could happen, this could happen. But I really just was okay, because I knew that I could pull out of the trial at any time. And that was something that was comforting. And, I had the power to do that. So I went ahead and signed all the paperwork, did my treatment, everything really worked as well as it could. So we did that during the pandemic, like I said, and things were a little bit different. And as far as going into the clinic and having all that done, my son took me to a lot of the infusions. He would wait for me in the car, and those long hours. So I was really appreciated him for all his efforts to make me feel comfortable as we could. So there was the clinical trial included having a diary where I would write down how I feel, how things were different. And so it's really kind of interesting to listen to your body and not really knowing if it's the meds that were affecting it, your lifestyle, or just anything in general. But I had never done that before. So that was quite interesting. Every little thing, my eyes were twitching or whatever it was. And then some other things that were not real comfortable. And, I would write them down in my little diaries and report that, as that was part of the trial. So I was just really being closely monitored. And all of a sudden, we were starting to do some of the other tests, and then they were finding other issues with my health that were identified. So we, did that, and ended up having some other health issues, and those were treated, and I'm doing really well with everything else from that. So that's one thing I would have never known, that I had, I had an appendix cancer, and they found that and took that. That was really easy. And just some other things that I'm able to address now. So from the testing that was involved with the trial. But I did finish the trial in September 2021, and I am happy to report I am in clinical remission, and there's really not better news than that. So I'm hoping for a very, very long time. I think they were telling me it was like 7 years is what the people who have gone through this trial so far. I would take that, but I hope for, like for more than that, but we will see. There's so many trials out there, so that I would encourage anyone to talk to their doctors and get involved in with your own health, get a second opinion, and participation with the trial has really, really, really helped me with my health. And with that, I can be a better person for myself and my family and my community. So I am happy that I did that. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina, for sharing your interesting story with us. We now welcome Dr. Adrian Wiestner.
Good afternoon. I'm Adrian Wiestner. I'm a hematologist at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, and I've been focusing on chronic lymphocytic leukemia for the past 20 years. It's my pleasure to review with you some clinical trials basics and review with you about what they are, why we do them, how we protect your safety if you choose to participate in a clinical trial. We'll go over your rights and the people you meet, the people who become your team. And then I want to give you some pointers of how you can find out whether participation in a clinical trial is right for you. Let me start with introducing my home institution, the Clinical Center of the NIH in Bethesda, Maryland. It is the largest hospital devoted entirely to clinical research. In 2018, we had more than 9,700 new patients coming to the clinical center. We have about 800 nurses and 1,300 physicians, dentists, and PhD researchers working at this institution. So why do we need clinical trials? Well, we may have a great idea in the laboratory. We experiment with new drugs in a dish. We may take it into animal models. And we're really excited about what we see that these new drugs can do. But to get from the laboratory, from this bench research, to actually making it into a medication, we need the clinical trials. And these clinical trials totally depend on the participation of volunteers. So patients and sometimes also healthy volunteers who help us find out whether a drug works and can be safely given. So you can imagine that it takes several steps to get from this laboratory research to actually a clinical medication. And so in clinical trials, these steps are broken down into phases. In a phase 1 clinical trial, we use a drug for the first time in patients or for the first time in a given group of patients for a drug that's maybe already been used in other diseases. So the first question here in this phase 1 is it safe to give this drug? And what dose of the drug should be given? What is safe to give? What is expected to be efficacious? So we also look for some early signs of activity. The drug then hopefully can move on to phase 2. In the phase 2, the drug activity becomes an important question. So we really want to see whether this drug works for CLL or for some other condition. And of course, safety always remains a key point that is observed in these clinical trials. In the phase 3, we then want to find out whether the new treatment is actually at least as good as the old treatment, or hopefully is actually better than the old standard of care. And that's often done in head-to-head comparisons. And if successful, what should come out of the phase 3 is approval by the Food and Drug Administration, meaning this really becomes a new drug that can be prescribed in an oncologist or in a physician's office. So how do we ensure you can safely go through the process of this clinical trial? Well, first of all, when you consider a clinical trial, you should get a lot of information. What is it about? What is the drug? What is the expected activity? What are possible side effects? So you should get enough information that you can truly understand what you're signing up for. And that then is called informed consent. So you're consenting to volunteer in this clinical trial. You remain a volunteer all through this clinical trial. And the key right you have is to discontinue participation at any time and for any reason. Questions you might ask is, what is the purpose of the study? So what are the key goals of this study? Why is it being done? Why is this a good option for me? What are your other options? Instead of participating in this trial, what are other options? What are the risks of participating here? And I think a question we often get, and I think a very good question, is that possible participants ask us about how other people are doing in the study. What have we seen? What maybe side effects have we seen? Has it worked for others? And then an important question is also, what is required of me? Because I mean, in the end, the goal of this participation in a clinical trial is to go through the study so that new information can be learned and the drug that's being tested can advance towards becoming a medication that can be prescribed. So you want to understand how much time do you have to commit and what potential procedures do you have to go through to participate. I also want to briefly introduce people that you won't see, but that are very involved in making sure you can go through a clinical trial safely. There is a lot of independent oversight, so independent of the investigators you meet. That's first of all, the Food and Drug Administration. Any new drug trials need to be registered with the Food and Drug Administration, and the experts there will look at it and make sure it's done in a proper and safe way. At the institution you participate, there will be an institutional review board that's composed of physicians, nurses, and lay people who oversee the study to make sure safety is maximized or risks are minimized and you can safely participate. Often in larger drug trials, there is also a data and safety monitoring board composed of experts. So in our case, that would be hematologists who help oversee that the study does not result in any unexpected safety concerns. Overall, this results in more testing than in standard practice, and it results in a very close monitoring by your study team. So your team, the person who's primarily responsible for the conduct of the study is called the principal investigator. Is often a physician, or most common for drug trials will be a physician. You will have a study coordinator, somebody who helps you work out all the scheduling. There's typically a research nurse, and often the research nurse really becomes the hub of the operation and your go-to person for any questions. There's additional clinical staff that may or may not be actually part of the research team. And behind the scenes, a lot of people you don't see also work on this clinical trial. They abstract the data that's coming out of the medical testing you go through. They help us write the protocols, write all these reports to these independent oversight bodies I discussed before. So it really takes a village to get a clinical trial going and conduct it. Can you or should you participate? Well, can you participate is often based on so-called eligibility criteria. So we may study a drug in a specific disease type, so you need to have the condition that really is being studied. Maybe also in need for treatment or having already had prior treatment and having relapsed disease that is studied in this particular trial. There's a consideration for your overall health and your current medications. Again, that really serves to ensure your safety going through the study. So how do you decide? Let me say, I think an important point is you should feel comfortable with where you are. You should feel comfortable with the team and be able to trust your team, because there's so much information. In the end, your team will break down the key points for you. And this relationship is really an important part of going through the study. You may ask whether the study will actually benefit you directly or will it benefit others? Will knowledge be gained? Let me just emphasize that this is for many people an important point, this fighting back. Or like our 80-year-old volunteer here said, it's important to me to participate in clinical trials so that maybe something can be learned or developed. And this is a lady who's gone through 6 or 7 different treatments for her disease. So that's this fighting back, this giving back, this helping develop the next treatment may be an important motivator to go into a clinical trial. So what resources are there to help you decide? Well, you could discuss the trial with your home oncologist. That's probably an expert, knowledgeable in what's going on. Also your primary care physician or patient organizations like the CLL Society, other patients who may have gone through clinical trials can help you inform yourself. And there are online tools. I would like to highlight here this tool, the clinicaltrials.gov website, where all the trials run are registered. You can search for them by geography, by disease type, by drug that you might have heard about. And it's really geared also towards patients to help them understand and find studies that are right for them. Let me just sidetrack for a second and tell you the studies I've discussed so far, phase 1 through phase 3, FDA approval. This is really developing new treatments, new drugs. But there are also a lot of studies that use existing treatments and ask really questions to gain more knowledge. Giving you here an example from a study we've done at the NIH. We wanted to see whether the approved zoster vaccine, the Shingrix vaccine, works for CLL patients, and whether treatment will reduce or benefit the vaccine response. And so we asked patients who were either untreated or being treated with ibrutinib or acalabrutinib to participate in this vaccination study. And really what we learned is that the Shingrix vaccine works very well for CLL patients. That's good news. And we also learned that some treatments may somewhat reduce the vaccine response. So we didn't really test anything new. We wanted to generate more knowledge about existing treatments. So you could, of course, also get this in your home oncologist's office, but doing this in a study helps really generate knowledge because it's in a systematic plan of investigation. And one final point, I think what's really key is that the participants in clinical trials should represent the patients that will use the medical products. And unfortunately, that's often not the case. Racial and ethnic minority groups are underrepresented in clinical trials. And this is a problem because people of different races or ethnicities, different ages, may react differently to certain medical products. And so if you think a clinical trial may be right for you, please talk to your healthcare provider about participating. So to summarize, really clinical trials develop the medicines of tomorrow. Your safety is a priority. You volunteer based on an understanding of risks and benefits, and that's called informed consent. You are a volunteer in the study and you retain the risks to quit if it becomes too much for you or you're uncomfortable with maybe side effects in the trial. I went over some resources you can use to help inform yourself and make the decision. And the diversity of participants really helps generate equitable health information. So thank you for your time. I look forward to discussions. And I would like to pass it on now to research nurse Kaitlin Kennard, who will continue discussion about practical issues.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kaitlin Kennard. I'm a clinical research nurse at the University of Pennsylvania in the lymphoma research program. In my role as a clinical research nurse, I work closely with our patients from the time they express interest in enrolling on a trial through the time their participation is completed. My goal for today is to review some of the basics of trials, including randomization, placebos, and blinding. I'll address some of the more intense monitoring that comes with trial participation. And lastly, we'll cover some additional considerations such as cost, lifestyle, and COVID-19. patients want to know, am I going to be a guinea pig? There are two implications here. The first is that you're going to be given a medication that nobody has ever tried before. And the second is that, like a lab animal, you don't have any say in the matter. The reality is there are very few patients who will be the first to receive a medication in order to test for safety. And if that is going to be you, your study team should discuss it with you before the time of consent. For most of our patients who enroll on trials, we already know that the drug is safe, so we're learning about effectiveness, side effects, and how the drug compares to our existing treatments. I think the key here when we're talking about guinea pigs is that unlike a guinea pig, our patients have autonomy. Guinea pigs can't make decisions for themselves, but as a patient, you should be an active participant in your treatment decision-making. You should weigh the pros and cons of your treatment options with your provider, the trial team, and your loved ones. And know that your trial participation is always, always voluntary. Once a medication has gone through testing to show that it's safe and effective, we need to learn whether the new medication is better than our current treatment. In order to test this, we do randomized trials. In a randomized trial, patients are randomly assigned to receive either the standard of care, which is our current treatment, or the investigational drug. Because of the randomization, you don't get to choose which treatment option you receive. But both are good options. You'll either get the standard, which we already know is a good option, or an investigational drug that's cutting edge and you wouldn't have access to outside of a trial. And in the end, if we do find that the investigational drug is better than our current treatment, these types of trials can lead to a new standard. For example, a few years ago, we saw the results of the trial comparing ibrutinib and Rituxan to FCR. Now we see BTK inhibitors like ibrutinib as frontline CLL treatment. Another thing that patients might worry about when they consider a clinical trial is whether they could get a placebo. A placebo is a medication that has no therapeutic effect, and sometimes you might hear it referred to as a sugar pill. In clinical trials, placebos are used to test whether the effects of the treatment are due to active medication or a placebo effect. A placebo effect is when patients may feel better simply because they think they're getting treatment. So there's some psychological component there. Placebos are rarely used in clinical trials for cancer, and they're never used if there's an effective alternative. You'll always be informed at the time of consent if the trial involves a placebo. However, if you participate in a trial with a placebo, you may not know whether you're receiving the placebo or the active treatment. And this is called blinding. In addition to the patient being blinded, we can also have double-blind trials where both the patient and the doctor don't know which treatment the patient's receiving. This can be a source of anxiety for patients. So again, it is not common in clinical trials for CLL, and you would be informed at the time of consent if the trial involves blinding. Now I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about the increased monitoring that comes with clinical trial participation. Of course, with any treatment, whether standard of care or investigational, there is the potential for side effects. Before you enroll in a trial, you'll receive an informed consent form, which contains all of the known or potential side effects of the medication. Additionally, you'll read about the possibility of unexpected side effects. And understandably, all of this can be scary and overwhelming. So to help alleviate some of this overwhelm, your research team can discuss with you which side effects they're seeing most frequently. And we can discuss the severity of those side effects, whether most people are finding those side effects to be manageable or to be difficult. And finally, we can discuss whether there are other medications that might be able to help you alleviate some of those side effects. One of the potential advantages to being on a clinical trial is that we're monitoring you really closely for side effects. We'll ask you to share with us in real time changes to your health. So even though it's overwhelming to read about all of those side effects in the consent form up front, Having a team that's readily available to you to help manage these side effects leads to superb medical care and hopefully provides you with some peace of mind. Another thing that we monitor closely while you're on a clinical trial is your medication list. Capturing all of your medications accurately allows us to monitor for potential drug interactions. Drug interactions can increase or decrease the potency of your treatment. And if we're increasing the potency of your treatment, you might end up with more side effects or toxic level of the drug. If we decrease the potency of your treatment, we might lose some of the potential effectiveness of the drug. And additionally, some trials will have medications that are simply prohibited while you're on the study. So it's really important that in addition to sharing all of your prescription medications, you share with your study team any over-the-counter medications that you're taking, any medications that you take just every once in a while, like Tylenol or Tums, and supplements, vitamins, medical cannabis, even topicals. In addition to the increased monitoring for side effects and drug interactions, clinical trials also involve more frequent visits and assessments than the standard of care. This helps us to monitor for safety purposes, and it's also how we learn more about the effectiveness of the new medication. If you participate in a clinical trial, you'll have more frequent appointments with your provider, more frequent blood work, and unfortunately, one of the downsides of being in a trial is that you may also require more frequent biopsies and more frequent imaging. For example, many patients with CLL will rarely, if ever, have CT scans as standard of care, but trials can require scans at regular intervals. So all of these things have potential advantages, but they're also can be difficult for you. So weigh them against the benefit of gaining access to these cutting-edge treatments. And now we'll cover some of the additional considerations that patients might want to look at before enrolling on a trial. Unfortunately, in today's day and age, in our country, cost is often a factor in treatment decision-making. One of the potential advantages of a clinical trial is that you may get access to a very expensive medication for free. However, there will be costs that the trial doesn't cover. On a clinical trial, all of the costs can be divided into two buckets. There's the standard of care bucket and the research-related bucket. Standard of care are typically thought of as appointments, blood work, other tests that any cancer patient would get, even if they were getting treatment outside of a clinical trial. These visits and procedures will be billed to your insurance company, so you may have co-pays or deductibles or even have to pay out of pocket. Research-related tests are tests that we wouldn't do routinely as part of standard of care, and these type of things should be paid for by the trial. Outside of the direct costs of treatment, frequent visits to the trial site also mean more money spent on gas, bus fares, parking, meals, and sometimes even hotels or other lodging. Some trials may reimburse you for some of these expenses or even provide a per visit stipend. So it's something else to consider when you're talking to your trial team. Some trials can also have a significant impact on your lifestyle. This is by no means the case for all trials, and these are also things that could potentially impact your lifestyle with standard of care therapies as well. For example, you may be required to have a caregiver present for a specific period of time after you receive treatment. This is the case for our CAR T studies and some of our studies with bispecific antibodies. You may be required to stay in the hospital for a period of time. There may be driving restrictions or dietary restrictions. And I mentioned just prior how frequently you may need to be at the trial site. So it's worthwhile to consider how far you'll be traveling to and from the site. For patients who have back-to-back visits and live out of state or several hours away, it may make sense to stay at a hotel or at a patient lodge closer to the trial site. And as I mentioned, in some cases, this can be reimbursed by the trial, or the site may have some funds for patient assistance. If you're working, that's another thing that you're going to want to discuss with your trial team. While we can't necessarily predict whether or not you'll be able to work throughout the trial, we can give you a sense of how other patients have done. And if you do need to take a leave of absence, your team should be able to help you with any paperwork. And last but not least, we can't have a presentation these days without touching on the impacts of COVID-19. And while I think the majority of these considerations apply to all patients receiving CLL treatment, they may have a more significant impact when it comes to clinical trial participation. For example, if you still need to get your COVID booster or Evusheld is available to you, you'll want to discuss the timing with your treatment team. The timing of the vaccine or Evusheld in relation to the investigational treatment may be dictated by the trial, or more likely, the investigational treatment may impact your immune system, which in turn can have an impact on the effectiveness of the vaccine. As patients with CLL, you're considered immunocompromised at baseline, so it's especially worthwhile to discuss with your provider what would happen if you were to contract COVID-19 while on study. Would COVID-19 treatments be permitted in the trial? Would you potentially need to delay your investigational treatment? Would you need to come off the trial altogether? And while I know these aren't things that are necessarily pleasant to think about, our goal is to always keep you safe and healthy, regardless of whether you're on or off a trial. So to wrap up, I'd like to reiterate that there are lots of practical factors to consider before enrolling on a clinical trial. But if it fits your needs and your lifestyle, clinical trial participation can have significant advantages for you as a patient. And it goes without saying that trial participation is vital to improving and advancing treatments for all CLL patients. With that, I'd like to say thank you to the CLL Society, to all of our patients and families, and of course, my never-ending gratitude to our clinical trial patients who trust us with their care daily. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wiestner, and thank you, Kaitlin Kennard, longtime friends of the CLL Society, for this really helpful and I think kind of a balanced approach to clinical trials, showing some of the benefits and some of the costs and hassles that are involved with it too. We're going to have a lot of time for questions and answers, which is good because we have a lot of them. But we do have that. We're going to repeat the one poll question to see if there's been any change. So if people could just answer this one simple question. So this is encouraging. We had a very high bar to begin with. 89% of people at the beginning said that they would participate in a clinical trial. Only 11% said no. So essentially, we've halved the number that say no now, with only 6% saying no and 94% saying yes. So I think we made clinical trials attractive. And I think most people who know my story know that I'm alive today because I participated in 2 clinical trials, and I actually participated in a 3rd clinical trial related to COVID-19. So very exciting. There's a lot of good questions. So let me get started, and I'm going to throw this out to both Kaitlin and Dr. Wiestner. Travel. Travel is different at the NIH than Kaitlin talked about. Can you talk a little bit about travel expenses, Dr. Wiestner, and how the NIH handles that? And maybe, Kaitlin, can you give us a little bit of sense of, practical tips for patients who do have to travel? So Dr. Wiestner, you want to go first?
Yes, thank you. So certainly important question. So NIH, the clinical center in Bethesda, actually supports the travel for patients to come to NIH. That can be a flight from out of state. That can be reimbursement for car expenses. So you have to live, I think it's 50 miles from the NIH to qualify for travel assistance. So if you're local, you don't qualify for that assistance. But this is for patients who are on clinical trials.
Kaitlin?
Yeah, so I think there's actually kind of a range of answers here. It depends a little bit. At my site, which is not just a research institution, it depends a little bit on the trial itself. Some trials, the sponsor, so either the pharmaceutical company or the industry that's running the trial, provide reimbursement for travel expenses. Sometimes, like I mentioned, they'll provide a per visit stipend. So that may or may not cover the costs of all your expenses, depending on how far away you live. And some of our studies don't really have any reimbursement, but we actually have a trial at Penn, so you can kind of be like dual enrolled in 2 studies that provide some funding and reimbursement for patients who are interested in trials who might not be able to participate otherwise because of costs such as travel expenses being a limiting factor. So there are definitely a lot of options, and I hope that your trial team can help you so that travel isn't one of the limiting factors.
Kaitlin, let me follow up because there's a lot of questions about the practical issues, and you did a nice job of covering that. Someone here has HMO insurance. Is that an issue? Can the tests, and if hospitalizations are required, can that be done locally by their HMO or the HMO hospital, or do they have to go to UPENN? Or if it's at Memorial Sloan Kettering or at UCSD, do they have to go to the facility where the trial is? How does that work?
That's a really good question, and it depends on what we're doing and whether the trial pays for it or not. So things that are paid for by the trial have to be done at our institution. But that kind of would negate the HMO needing to be involved. Things that aren't paid for by the study can sometimes be done at outside institutions. I think that having an HMO would probably make it a little bit tricky depending on what trial it is you're enrolling on. So it's something that you'd want to talk to the team about beforehand, so you don't end up with a lot of bills or something like that.
Dr. Wiestner, one of the attractive things about the NIH trials is the standard of care issue doesn't come up. Is that my correct understanding of it, that, or is that an oversimplification of it, that essentially at the NIH all the costs are covered, whether it's a scan or whether it's routine stuff, that there's not that division that Kaitlin pointed out that goes on in a tryout outside of the National Institutes of Health?
Yes, so that's correct. So the NIH, everything is paid for out of the NIH budget. So all the exams, all the lab work, everything. So if somebody comes to NIH for a second opinion or for consideration of a trial, there are no costs for that visit. The first time you come to NIH, you have to make the trip by yourself. So your first trip, you may not qualify for any travel assistance. Once you enroll in a clinical trial, everything is provided for free: the drugs, the exams, the visits. We don't work at all with insurance. So there's no billing to insurance. You don't have to have insurance, or your insurance does not have to cover what you get at the NIH. But that only applies to if you can enroll in a clinical trial. So we don't provide standard of care treatment free, right? So what is free is really the participation on the clinical study. That's basically the deal. The NIH funding is to support the research. It's not to support free standard of care treatments.
So, Kaitlin, let me follow up on this to dig into it a little bit deeper. The standard of care issue comes up. And I've been in clinical trials, and often in clinical trials, and you were very frank about this, you get imaging more often, you get biopsies more often. And these, at least in my case, were billed as part of standard of care. But the standard of care is not to get a CT scan every 3 months. I mean, there's no guidelines that say to do that. So can you address this issue, because it's a big concern? And while I'm on it, can patients refuse CT scans? Can they switch to an MR? Are you worried as a clinician about your patients getting scanned too much? They are, patients are worried about that. So I'm giving you a whole bunch of stuff here that are some of the negatives. And I know you must deal with this because you're helping patients decide whether a trial is right for them. So maybe you can address it. And Adrian, maybe you want to add some stuff after too. So why don't you start, Kaitlin? Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess to start with the fact that sometimes things that we think shouldn't be standard of care might be billed as standard of care. And that is kind of unfortunately decided in the background between like the institution that's running the trial and the either pharmaceutical company or whatever the sponsor of the study is, and how much a lot of time funding they have for all of these different things. I personally wish that we didn't have to do all of these scans. I think that especially some of the doctors that I work with are really against it. And depending on the study, we might have the option to do MRIs instead of CTs or PET scans that expose patients to some radiation. But that's not always the case. And I'm hesitant to answer whether or not you can refuse the imaging and the biopsies and things. I think technically you have the right to refuse anything that you want. Your participation is voluntary. You know, depending on what treatment you get and how far into the study you are and what your doctor recommends, they may say, you know what, I'm going to recommend that you don't get these scans, and the study site will just take it as a deviation, meaning we're not following the protocol. But you can also have the problem where if like we don't follow the protocol for enough patients frequently enough, either that patient may have to be withdrawn from the study, or you know they might say you're not allowed to do the doctor might not be allowed to do the study anymore. So it's something we kind of have to like balance very carefully. Did that answer all the questions there?
I think so. I don't know. Dr. Wiestner, did you want to add anything to Kaitlin there?
Maybe just briefly on CT scans. So yes, clinical trials often have more CT scans or have actually CT scans built in that by guidelines are not really part of how we recommend to assess CLL patients in the clinic, in the routine clinics. You have to understand really that for clinical trials, the CT scans provide really valuable information. And certainly there could be a push towards using them less, but there is very valuable information. It's also not uncommon that CT scans uncover something that was not suspected. And that can, like Christina mentioned in the beginning, can actually lead to really valuable health information for you. So it's not just a risk component. It also provides additional monitoring. It's part of this close monitoring that can uncover other health issues or detect the side effect early on before it becomes a clinical problem. And a brief note on, I saw that somebody asked a question about whether our watch and wait trial at the NIH involves CT scans. No, we don't do CT scans outside of treatment studies where we really need the CT to understand what the treatment does. We don't do routine scans in untreated patients on the watch and wait study.
Can you tell us about your natural history trial a little bit, what that's involved, if patients are interested in Kaitlin? Also, there's also a question about patients in watch and wait or active observation, and if you have any trials or know of any trials that are open. But maybe Dr. Wiestner, you can start and talk about your natural history trial, which has been going on for many years now.
It has, yes. So the first version of that actually opened in the 1990s in the NCI. We revised all that in 2008. So that's our current natural history study. I would say that a lot of places, a lot of CLL centers actually do natural history studies. We have to write a specific protocol because it's NIH where we have to have a research protocol. On a natural history study, we basically do routine physicals and lab work. Anything else, we specifically ask you whether you would volunteer for that on top of just seeing us. And so we do draw some additional research blood to understand the biology of CLL, to test new drugs. We have in the past asked patients to give us lymph node biopsies because it was crucial to understand what's actually happening in the lymph nodes. That's where the CLL cells grow. But this is always an additional question that you can say yes or no to, and that doesn't affect participation in the natural history study. And I would say that a lot of academic centers in some ways have their routine CLL clinics where you probably also get the option to sign up for donating blood for research. So that becomes similar. It's just because of our institutional way of doing things, we had to write out a specific plan that is now a clinical trial, the natural history study.
Kaitlin, anything you want to add about that issue about natural history or trials for active observation, watch and wait?
Yeah, so I don't think it's open anymore, but we did have a trial for patients who were in watch and wait where they would get serial blood draws and also quality of life surveys to kind of ask about what was going on with their stress levels and depression and things like that, to compare what was going on in their immune system in their blood with those surveys. And so I think that there's a lot of value to our patients in watch and wait who are interested in participating in things like that, in doing that, because that's how we learn. So I don't think at the moment that we have anything like that open. We have a biobanking study that's open to all of our patients, whether they have CLL or another kind of cancer, but it's not CLL specific.
Yeah, I would add just another point about all these imaging, that there's a number of cases, and people have put up questions here, where they found incidental findings with the CT scans. And there's clear data that people who enter clinical trials and get the same treatment inside or outside of a clinical trial, the people inside of the clinical trial with the more closer observations actually tend to do better and have better survival data. Here's one that bugs me. Somebody has a second cancer or a cancer, they go in, they're in the clinical trial, they have a mammo, and they find they have breast cancer. Are they booted out of the trial? Can they enter? We're dealing with an older population in CLL, so we do see a lot of prostate cancer, colon cancer, things like that, skin cancers. How does that work? Because most of the time when you read the exclusion criteria, if you have a second malignancy, you're kicked out of most trials. You're excluded, or if you develop it. So can you address that, Kaitlin? And then maybe Dr. Wiestner had some thoughts on that.
I think it's a little bit more complicated than just you're simply booted out of the study. It depends on the type of cancer and whether it needs systemic therapy. Some trials, if it's something that we can just watch and wait, so a second cancer that doesn't actually need treatment, you can stay on the study. Some studies, even if it needs treatment, if it's something that's like a one and done, like a skin cancer where we're going to remove that cancerous lesion and you're going to be considered cancer-free, you can also still stay on the study. Usually, if you need some sort of systemic treatment like chemotherapy or radiation or another treatment like that that's ongoing, you wouldn't be able to stay on the trial. And the reason being, it would be hard for us to parse out what is actually treating your CLL at that point and to get the good response evaluation data that we need for the studies. Dr.
Wiestner?
Yes, it could be a very, very long discussion. It is a very important point, but it is also very complex. Let me just start with saying that your principal investigator, your study team, they usually are not in a position to just make those decisions by themselves. Okay, so if we find somebody who is in a clinical trial, somebody enrolled in a clinical trial, we find a second cancer, let's say a lung cancer, let's say a breast cancer, because we do CT scans. And we have to report this to our institutional oversight body. They may have very strong feelings that it's in the interest of the patient to come off the treatment because this cancer was diagnosed during treatment. Who knows? Maybe that treatment actually accelerated the cancer, right? So there is a lot of consideration for the patient and for the patient's safety. Also, Some of the cancers that may be found or be present in somebody at the time they would like to enroll in the CLL trial may actually need more aggressive treatment and may actually be more threatening to survival than the CLL. So then you have to go for the by first principles, you want to address the imminent danger and potentially defer that CLL treatment or the trial participation. So it's very complex, but just realize that the clinical trial team you see are not the only ones who can just make that decision.
There's a question, and I think both of you addressed this, the diversity and equity issue. So I'll just read the question. Will equity and diversity, anyone be denied on the opportunity for participation in a clinical trial based on race? Well, is it first come, first first served? Will trials with limited openings be rationed based on race now? Anything along that lines that you're seeing? Kaitlin, do you want to take that one on?
So none of the studies that I've worked on have inclusion or exclusion criteria based on race. They're not limiting the number of patients of a certain race that can enroll to allow space for another race. I think we're trying to be more equitable in the sense that we're trying to make sure that, you know, patients of all races enroll so that we can get good data. But we're not cherry picking or leaving slots specifically for one group or another.
Yeah. And I take it you would agree with that, Dr. Wiestner?
Yes, it's the same for us. And first come, first serve seems a little bit like it's excluding people, but realize most clinical trials take a little longer than the sponsors of the trial would actually hope. So it's rare to see clinical trials just, you know, be filled overnight and that's it. So I'm not aware of any trial that stratifies inclusion. Well, shouldn't say that. I'm not aware of a CLL trial that stratifies inclusion by ethnicity, race, obviously by age. Nobody under 18 would be enrolled in a CLL trial.
If you're interested in clinical trials, Kaitlin, help us understand. We know about clinicaltrials.gov. Give us some tips on that, and especially maybe if you're not in, you know, near Bethesda or near Philadelphia or New York City or a big, you know, center. What does someone who's maybe seeing a community hematologist in a more, you know, rural setting, how do they find about clinical trials? How do they get access to them? What are you telling those patients?
So as somebody at one of those urban institutions that's connected to a university, we have patients reach out to us from rural areas, from their local hematology, oncology offices, from other countries, and all kinds of things, and, you know, via email. And we're happy to work with those patients. Usually we need their medical records to be able to tell whether or not it's worthwhile for them to come to our institution. But, you know, if you find something on clinicaltrials.gov, you should be able to contact. There should be a person listed on clinicaltrials.gov that's like the coordinator or a contact person for that study. So you should be able to reach out to them. And, you know, the CLL Society, the LLS, they also have good resources that can connect you with providers that have trials open that might fit your needs.
Yeah, people can reach out to us and we can connect you and do that too. And LLS has a really good program for clinical trials in terms of that. Dr. Wiestner, anything you wanted to add to that?
Not really, no.
Okay, I think this is an easy one. Does Evusheld restrict eligibility to a trial? I think I know the answer to that, but Dr. Wiestner, you want to take that?
Not that I'm aware of, but we recently ran into the problem that Evusheld is a monoclonal antibody, and many trials are written no monoclonal antibody therapy within the last months or whatever time frame they applied, thinking, of course, about rituximab or obinutuzumab, so antibodies that are used for CLL therapy. But that has been a holdup for patients we wanted to enroll in one of our clinical trials. But in principle, it does not exclude. And my understanding is that this language may also be now revised so that Evusheld would not even be a holdup anymore.
That's an interesting point. It's a little confusing for patients sometimes because they're both monoclonal antibodies. Here's one that is a sensitive issue for some patients. We've been talking about CLL. Do all of these things also apply to SLL? And so if and I've also seen trials where you have to have a measurable node. You have to have a node that's at least 1.5 centimeters. But some of us just have a really high white count, a high lymphocyte count without any adenopathy. And others of us have massive adenopathy, but our counts are normal. So are we excluded from trials on the SLL side and the CLL trial? Kaitlin, do you want to take that?
I think it just depends entirely on the study and the inclusion-exclusion criteria, whether or not you have to have an elevated lymphocyte count to be involved.
Yeah. If somebody, here's a very specific question. Can someone donate a lymph node? Is that something that happens? I also got somebody who wanted to donate their body to science, and I know that they can, I recommended they talk to their doctor about after they pass. Most places have that kind of option. Is that something, somebody wants to contribute, what would you tell them to do? I'll start with you, Dr. Wiestner. Is there somebody who wants to make a contribution? How would you recommend that they do that?
So thank you very much. First of all, really that's great to partner in that research by contributing these really valuable clinical specimens, be that from blood or lymph node. And I would really also like to thank over 30 patients who have donated lymph nodes to us for research purposes and actually done that by surgery. So that was really a surgical lymph node resection for research, and it's been very informative. So yes, absolutely happy to have that donation. We do this on our natural history study. Again, it's not mandated to give a lymph node for participation in that natural history study. It's just something we appreciate if we find volunteers who give that. So that's an option with us. In more and more clinical trials, I think investigators are wanting to understand what's happening in the lymph node. And so more and more trial may actually ask for volunteer lymph node biopsies, maybe before treatment or even again during treatment.
So the way that patient would move forward would be to go to the NIH and ask about the natural history trial, enroll in that, and as part of that, they could have the option to give have an excisional biopsy of a lymph node,
absolutely
accessible lymph
yes.
node. Well, here's one, that's somebody's been adamantly told not to join a clinical trial by an oncology nurse. So as an oncology nurse, Kaitlin, I'm going to have you talk about, clinical trials aren't for everyone. And, one of my doctors said that trials are for the patients, not the other way around. Patients aren't for trials, and you've got to make sure it's right for you. But do you have a response to that? Because, we're at the CLL Society, we're big on expert care and, more than novel therapies and clinical trials, because that's how you get the best possible care and access to the newest drugs. But obviously a lot, how do you address those issues when a patient's been told adamantly not to go into a clinical trial?
Well, I think I would need to know a little bit more about why that nurse has recommended that. Is it for that specific patient? Is there something about that patient's circumstances that, makes the nurse say you shouldn't join a trial? Or did that nurse just have a bad experience personally? I'd need a little bit more information about where that recommendation came from. Like you said, Dr. Kaufman, I don't think that a clinical trial is necessarily right for every single patient. And we have patients who also come off trials when they realize, you know what, this is too many visits for me. I'm elderly and I just want to, you know, take my medicine and come every couple months to see the doctor. So again, I think it just depends on the patient and the circumstances, but I agree that I think it gives you the access to the newest, best treatments.
I'm gonna ask both of you this question. Trials at the NIH for CLL patients that you want to share, Dr. Wiestner, and then I'll ask you that, Kaitlin, if there's particular trials that you have ongoing right now that patients should know about at various stages of their disease. Dr. Wiestner, you want to go first?
Yes, thank you. So we talked about the natural history. For treatment trials, we currently have participated in a phase 1 with a molecule we've done a lot of laboratory work on that is really geared towards patients who developed progression resistance to ibrutinib or acalabrutinib, or even to both those drugs and venetoclax. So really something for patients who otherwise right now don't have any good treatment options. So that's a trial that's available. And there are, in the NCI, our sister institute has a trial for patients with rectus transformation. So that may also be. So what you hear here a little bit is maybe that the focus for us is shifting towards patients who don't have an immediate good option available through the community. With the new treatments available like venetoclax, BTK inhibitors, for a lot of patients are really good options at home or through their local center. We also have a study that investigates vaccination in patients in relationship to different treatments patients are on. And we're working towards a study to better assess cardiac risks in patients on treatment. That study is not open yet, but we hope to have that by the second half of the year.
Kaitlin, what's happening at UPENN?
So at the moment, we actually only have 2 studies that are actively enrolling for CLL patients, and both of them would be for patients who have had multiple lines of prior therapies. One would be LOXO 305, and the other would, and that one actually you have to have failed 5 lines of prior therapy. So there's not a lot of patients who are gonna, who are gonna meet the criteria for that one. And then the other is DTRM, which is a BTK inhibitor, and it's in combination with a couple of other medications. And that one is a little bit more accessible for patients, but I know a lot of patients have similar BTK availability at home, so maybe not a big draw for patients. We do have some studies that are coming in the next couple months that I think will be a lot more exciting, including some bispecific antibody trials.
Dr. Wiestner, there's a couple more questions on the natural history trial. Could just outline what you're hoping to learn from that, and if somebody joins that trial, can they stay with their current CLL local doctor or local expert?
Yes, thank you. So absolutely, we encourage that you stay with your local oncologist, and depending on where you are within your CLL journey, we would potentially see you every 6 months, maybe once a year. We see some untreated patients who are very, very stable every 2 years. So we can enroll patients who are untreated. We also enroll patients who are currently on a treatment, be that the BTK inhibitor or venetoclax. So the study has gone through different stages. So in the beginning, we looked a lot at prognostic markers. Then we geared it towards understanding what drives CLL. That led actually, among others, to BTK inhibitor therapy. And now we're looking into vaccine responses. So patients who are on the watch and wait study, on the natural history, it's actually not the watch and wait study anymore because it enrolls patients who are on treatment, right? So it's a natural history study throughout the whole a life journey of a CLL patient. So there are a lot of also questions around good supportive care, like the vaccinations, or assessing cardiac risk factors on targeted therapy. So these are types of studies towards generating more knowledge around what do these treatments do to the CLL cells, to the normal immune system, to other organ systems potentially.
Here's one that seems obvious, and one that if you're in a double-blinded trial, and when do you find out which drug you got? Is it when the trial ends? When does it become unblinded? Is it when you get off the drug, but the trial is still ongoing for other patients? How do you find out if you've been getting saline or a sugar pill, or you've been getting the active drugs? Which arm you're in? Wow. When is that broken for the patient and for the doctor? Kaitlin, do you know that?
Yeah, so we actually have one double-blind study for CLL. It's not currently enrolling, but the way that particular study works is patients will either be getting ibrutinib or placebo blinded after they've gotten into an MRD negative status with venetoclax plus ibrutinib. So they're MRD negative, and then once they reach that point, they get blinded to either ibrutinib or the placebo. And once their MRD is detected as positive or they show signs of progression, that's when we would unblind them. And the reason being the way that study is built, if they were receiving the placebo, we would restart ibrutinib. If they were receiving the ibrutinib, we would restart venetoclax. So that's a really unique study. I think in most cases, once your treatment or your CLL progresses, or once you decide to come off the study, is when you would be unblinded.
Is that the same at the NIH generally, Dr. Wiestner?
So in my institution, in my program, we actually do not participate in placebo-controlled randomized trials. So in general, my understanding is in the double-blind trials, it's an external review committee that actually has access to the data collection. And that's the committee that makes a decision on unblinding the trial. How exactly the steps then are for the participants to be informed what arm they were in may depend on the particular trial and the institutions involved.
Well, there's a lot of questions that are coming in at the last minute, and we're not going to get to them, but if you send those to asktheexpert@cllsociety.org, we'll try to respond to those. Kaitlin, any final words or thoughts that you want to share about the role of clinical trials and management of CLL, SLL?
I think that clinical trials, like I said, are a really good option for patients that it fits their needs and their lifestyle, and again, gives you access to really good treatments. And Dr. Kaufman, you're living proof, right? So thank you to everybody for joining us.
Dr. Wiestner, I'll give you the last word.
Thank you. I would just like to thank everybody who participates or considered participating. It's really a way of fighting back, of giving back, and of advancing and also benefiting. If you think about the venetoclax and BTK inhibitor trials, these were really studies that immediately benefited participants. So there's really more and more also a lot of good coming directly to you by participating.
Well, thank you to everyone. I'd like to thank AstraZeneca and Beijing and Pharmacyclists and Janssen for making this event possible through their support. I want a big thanks to Christina Rodriguez Fuller. She couldn't be here for the Q&A, but I think hearing her real story, Dr. Wiestner, as always, and Kaitlin Kennard, I'm so grateful for your insights. And I think we presented a pretty balanced point of view. As I said before, this is recorded, and it's usually up within a week. If we didn't answer your question, there's the link, Ask the Experts. At the end of June, on June 28th, we have a webinar on BTK inhibitors, which is going to dive a little bit deeper. Dr. Matt Davids out of the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute will be leading that discussion. So that's He's a great teacher. It should be really worth attending. We have something exciting, which isn't really clinical trial oriented. Another big announcement, registration for our first virtual 5K walk run is opening. The event will be held on July 23rd. So mark it on your calendars and, register on our website. And this is our first sort of peer-to-peer kind of fundraising and getting to know each other outside of the website. So we're very excited about that. And please remember, CLL Society is invested in your long life. Please invest in the long life of the CLL Society. There is a event survey that we need for you to fill out. We really do read these carefully. We listen carefully to them. Your feedback is critically important to us. So please complete it. We use it to tweak and make things better. And thank you for attending, and be strong. We're all in this together. Thanks.